March 3, 1943. 6:47 a.m. A wall of 12 B-25. Mitchell bombers screams across the Bismarck Sea at 50 feet above the water engines, howling like banshees, and then every single gun opens fire at once. 168 50-caliber machine guns. The noise is not a sound. It is a physical force. The Japanese transport, Kyokusei Maru, explodes in a curtain of fire and shredded steel before its captain can even scream an order. In 30 seconds, the ship is dead. In 40 minutes, it is gone. And this is just the first ship of the morning. By sunset on March 3rd, 8 Japanese transport ships and 4 destroyers are burning or sinking beneath the Bismarck Sea. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers sent to reinforce New Guinea never arrive. The convoy is not defeated. It is obliterated. Allied losses: 4 aircraft. 13 men. The most lopsided naval air victory in the entire Pacific War, and it happened because of one man that almost nobody has ever heard of. A 43-year-old former Navy mechanic from a small town in Arkansas, crouching under an airplane wing with a welding torch at 2 in the morning, following an idea that every single military engineer in America had officially declared impossible. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, and the engineers were wrong. To understand what Paul Gunn actually did, you need to understand exactly how bad things were in the Southwest Pacific in 1942. Not bad in the way that politicians describe setbacks. Bad in the way that young men stop coming home. The Japanese Empire had spent the first 6 months of the war building what military historians would later call the most impenetrable supply chain in the Pacific. From their main base at Rabaul on New Britain, they were running a steady river of convoys down to New Guinea, pouring troops, ammunition, food, and reinforcements into their positions faster than Allied forces could push them back. General George Kenney arrived to take command of the 5th Air Force in late July 1942, and what he found made his stomach turn. In the month of July alone, the 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20 Havoc bombers, attempting to stop Japanese convoys from high altitude. 11. The math was brutal and simple. High-altitude bombing against moving ships had a hit rate so low it was practically meaningless. Bombardiers dropping ordnance from 15,000 feet against ships doing 15 knots in open water were averaging 1 hit for every 70 bombs dropped. 1 in 70. Meanwhile, when pilots tried to come down lower to improve accuracy, the Japanese deck gunners, who were well-trained, well-armed, and highly motivated, tore the incoming bombers apart. Captain Ed Larner had watched 3 of his own crews go down in flames over the Coral Sea in a single week. 3 crews. Men he had eaten breakfast with, men whose wives had names he knew, gone in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The Japanese commanders knew it too. They had no fear of Allied air power against their shipping. They moved convoys in daylight. They moved them in bad weather. They moved them with the casual confidence of people who believe they cannot be stopped. Because at that moment in the war, they were right. But nobody had talked to Paul Gunn yet. Paul Irvin Gunn was not a general. He was not a strategic planner or a Pentagon theorist or a man whose name appeared in newspapers. He was a former Navy enlisted man from Quitman, Arkansas, who had spent 21 years learning how aircraft engines worked from the inside out, how metal behaves under stress, and what an airplane can do when you push it far beyond what the manual says. He had left the Navy in 1939, moved his family to the Philippines, and built Philippine Airlines from scratch, with 5 Beechcraft planes and pure stubbornness. He was flying inter-island cargo routes when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and within 48 hours he had put himself and every plane he owned at the disposal of the U.S. Army Air Forces. He was already too old to be a combat pilot by regulation. He did not care. Kenney took one look at the man and commissioned him as a captain on the spot. But then the Japanese took Manila, and when Manila fell in January 1942, Paulie Gunn and their 4 children were still there. His wife, his daughters, his son Nathaniel. Swept up in the Japanese occupation and locked inside Santo Tomas internment camp, where they would remain as prisoners for the next 3 years. Paul Gunn found out from a reconnaissance report. Not a phone call. A reconnaissance report. He told nobody how he felt about that. He simply went back to work. Here is what Gunn saw that the engineers and the planners had missed. The problem with anti-shipping bombing was not the bombs. The bombs were fine. The problem was getting to the ship. Every approach to a Japanese convoy was a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire from the deck gunners. Those gunners were the guardian wall that made high-altitude bombing necessary, and high-altitude bombing was useless, so the wall had to come down first. And the only way to knock down the wall fast enough to matter was to hit it with so much forward firepower at such close range so fast that the gunners never had time to aim. Skip bombing was the key. If a pilot flew in low 50 feet above the water and released a bomb at just the right moment, the bomb would skip across the surface of the ocean like a flat stone punch through the hull of the ship at the waterline and detonate inside the engine room. Devastating. Potentially lethal to any ship it hit. The technique had been tested in theory. The physics were sound, but nobody could do it in combat because the approach run was suicide. Coming in low and slow against a ship with its guns active meant the bomber never reached release range. It burned first, unless the bomber could kill the guns before they killed the bomber. Gunn sat in the maintenance hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane and looked at the nose of a Douglas A-20 Havoc. It had 4 .30 caliber machine guns. 30 caliber rounds bounced off steel ship plating like gravel thrown against a wall. But the fuselage had room. The nose had space. And there were dozens of wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters sitting in the boneyard with their 50 caliber guns still intact. The pilots were dead. The guns were not. He pulled the bombardier seat out of an A-20. He stripped 4 50 caliber guns from wrecked fighters. He welded a steel mounting frame inside the nose compartment with his own hands, running a torch through the night while the mechanics slept. 4 guns. Combined rate of fire, 1,700 rounds per minute. At close range against an unarmored superstructure and exposed gun crew, that was not a weapon. That was an execution. General Kenny gave him 1 week to prove it worked. The first test flight almost killed the pilot. The 4 guns weighed 64 pounds each, plus 200 pounds of ammunition, and the weight shift pushed the center of gravity so far forward that the modified A-20 barely climbed and wanted to nose over on every turn. Gunn spent 2 days moving equipment aft, adjusting tail trim, recalculating balance points by hand, with no stress calculations, no computer modeling, no formal engineering process. Just a man who knew airplanes doing math on a notepad, guided by 40 years of mechanical instinct. The second test pilot said the plane flew like it was angry, but it flew. On September 12, 1942, 16 modified A-20s hit the Japanese airfield at Buna. They came in at treetop level, guns hammering. They destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground and suppressed every anti-aircraft position on the field. 0 A-20s lost. 0. Before the modification, those same gun positions had been killing Allied bombers on every mission. After the modification, the gunners never got a shot off before the strafers were already through and gone. Kenny wanted more. But Gunn already knew the A-20 was not the final answer. Its range was too short to reach Japanese bases across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Its bomb load was too light to sink anything larger than a barge. He needed a bigger platform, a heavier airframe with more space, more range, more capacity for the next evolution of the concept. He needed the B-25 Mitchell. In December 1942, Gunn took a B-25C and tore the nose apart. He removed the bombardier station and the original nose guns entirely. He installed 4 50 caliber guns in the solid nose, 4 more in external cheek packs mounted on the fuselage sides, and rotated the top turret forward so it could fire straight ahead. 10 forward-firing guns. Then he added 2 more on each side. 14 guns, total. At peak fire, the modified B-25 was throwing 215 pounds of lead per second in a single forward direction. The ground crew at Charter Towers took one look at it and called it Pappy's Folly. Kenny ordered 12 more conversions immediately, then sent the blueprints to Wright Field in Ohio. The Army Air Force engineers studied the modifications for 3 days and sent back a formal message. The modifications were impractical. The balance was wrong. The aircraft would be too heavy. It would not fly properly. They recommended grounding every single modified B-25 immediately. Kenny was in Washington when the message arrived. He walked into General Arnold's office where the Wright Field engineers were waiting to explain why Pappy Gunn's gunship was impossible. And Kenny looked at those engineers and at the man behind the desk and told them something that stopped the room cold. 12 of those impossible airplanes had just played the decisive role in destroying an entire Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every transport sunk. Every destroyer either sunk or crippled. 60 more strafers were already being modified in Australia. And a 43-year-old mechanic from Arkansas with no formal engineering degree and no stress calculations and no wind tunnel data had just changed the course of the Pacific War. But the convoy mission was only the beginning, because what came next would make even the Bismarck Sea look like a warm-up. Paul Gunn had done the impossible. He had taken a medium bomber, stripped out everything the engineers said was essential, welded in guns that the manual said would never fit, and proven in combat that the entire theory of anti-shipping warfare needed to be rewritten. 12 B-25 strafers, 1 Japanese convoy, 0 transports surviving. The Wright Field engineers had called it impossible right up until the moment Kenny walked into General Arnold's office and told them it had already happened. That should have been the end of the argument. It was not, because destroying a convoy in combat is one thing. Convincing the United States Army Air Force's bureaucracy to rebuild its entire bomber production line around the modifications of a 43-year-old former Navy mechanic with no formal engineering degree is something else entirely. And standing between Paul Gunn and that goal was a wall of brass regulations and institutional pride that made Japanese anti-aircraft fire look almost friendly by comparison. Brigadier General Howard Ramsey had been in the Army Air Forces for 22 years. He had attended the right schools, filed the right reports, and risen through the right channels to become the senior logistics and procurement officer overseeing bomber modification policy for the Pacific Theater. He was not a stupid man. He was something more dangerous than a stupid man. He was a competent man who had decided based on 22 years of institutional experience that he already knew how things worked. When the proposal to factory integrate guns modifications into standard B-25 production reached his desk in March 1943, he read it carefully, annotated it in the margins, and sent it back with a cover memo that was 4 pages long and contained the phrase, "Outside acceptable engineering parameters, no fewer than 7 times." The meeting in Kenny's operations room at Port Moresby lasted 40 minutes. Ramsey had brought 2 engineers from Wright Field. They had charts. They had stress calculations. They had wind tunnel data going back 18 months. Gunn sat across the table in a flight suit that still had red Australian dust on the knees and looked at the charts the way a man looks at a map of a country he has already walked through on foot. "Colonel Gunn," Ramsey said, tapping the stress analysis with one finger. "The muzzle blast from 1450 caliber guns firing simultaneously will buckle the forward fuselage skin within 40 to 60 operational hours. Your field modification works right now because the aircraft are new. Give it 2 months of combat flying and you will have structural failures. You will lose crews." Gunn looked at him. "We already lost crews. We were losing 11 aircraft a month trying to bomb from altitude and hitting nothing." "That is not the point." "General, with respect, that is exactly the point." Ramsey leaned back. His voice dropped half a register. "I am recommending a formal review period of 90 days before any further modifications are approved for production. If the data supports your approach after proper analysis, we will move forward through appropriate channels." 90 days. The Japanese were reinforcing their positions across New Guinea every week. 90 days meant hundreds of additional Allied casualties. 90 days meant convoys arriving at Ley and Wewak and Finschhafen unopposed, while American pilots died trying to stop them the old way. Gunn understood in that moment that Ramsey was not his enemy in any personal sense. Ramsey was the living embodiment of a system that had been built over decades to prevent mistakes, and that same system was now moving too slowly to survive contact with reality. He was 2 days away from being formally reassigned to a non-combat administrative role when Lieutenant Colonel Don Hall found him in the maintenance hangar at 3 in the morning. Hall was 31 years old, a former aeronautical engineering instructor from Purdue who had transferred to the Pacific Theater specifically because he was tired of teaching theory while other men flew combat. He had read Gunn's original modification blueprints, not the formal summary. The actual hand-drawn blueprints, measurements, and pencil notes in the margins, the blast tube solutions sketched in the corner where Gunn had figured out mid-drawing how to protect the fuselage skin from muzzle blast. Hall had stared at that sketch for 20 minutes, and then gone looking for the man who drew it. "You solved the fuselage problem already," Hall said, sitting down on an ammunition crate. "The blast tubes. You extend them beyond the propeller arc and redirect the gas pressure outward. Ramsey's engineers never looked at that part of the drawing." Gunn kept his eyes on the engine he was working on. They looked at what they wanted to see. "I can get you a formal demonstration," Hall said. "One flight, in front of Ramsey, in front of Kenny, in front of whoever needs to watch. Not combat, not a field test. A controlled demonstration with instrumented measurement. Strain gauges on the fuselage skin, pressure sensors on the blast tubes, full telemetry. If the numbers hold up, Ramsey has nothing left to stand on. And if the numbers don't hold up..." Hall was quiet for a moment. "Then you were wrong, and I was wrong, and Ramsey gets his 90 days. Gunn set down the wrench. "When?" 4 days. They had 4 days to instrument a B-25, calibrate the sensors, brief the test pilot, and arrange for every relevant senior officer in the 5th Air Force to be standing on a tarmac at Townsville, watching. Hall pulled in favors from 3 different maintenance squadrons. Gunn worked 36 of the next 96 hours without sleeping. The strain gauges were mounted at 12 points along the forward fuselage. The blast tube extensions were welded to within 1/16 of an inch of Gunn's original specification. The ammunition was loaded to combat weight. Everything was real. Nothing was simulated. The morning of the demonstration, April 9, 1943, was overcast and humid, the kind of Queensland morning where the air sits on your skin like a wet cloth. 11 senior officers were present. Ramsey stood with his arms folded and his face completely neutral. His 2 right field engineers stood slightly behind him with clipboards. Nobody was talking. The modified B-25 sat at the end of the runway, looking exactly like what it was, a medium bomber, with its nose rebuilt by a man who did not have time to do things the regulation way. The test pilot, Captain James Moriarty, ran the engines to full power and held the brakes. The airframe shook. Then the brakes released, and the B-25 accelerated down the runway and lifted cleanly into the overcast sky. And for 4 minutes, nothing happened except that everyone on the ground stood and watched it circle and said nothing. Then, Moriarty lined up on the target range. He came in at 50 feet, 240 knots. The guns opened at 800 yards, and the noise was not like anything anyone standing on that tarmac had heard in peacetime. It was not a burst. It was a sustained mechanical roar, a sound like industrial machinery running at speed, and the tracers converged on the target frame in a single concentrated stream that walked through the steel plate in 2 seconds and kept going. Moriarty pulled up, banked, came around again. Second pass. Same altitude, same speed, same guns. Third pass. The target frame was no longer recognizable as a target frame. Moriarty landed. The ground crew pulled the strain gauge data. Hall had the preliminary numbers in 12 minutes. He walked directly to Ramsey, held out the datasheet, and said nothing. Ramsey read it. He read it again. Peak fuselage stress during full 14-gun fire. 63% of the design limit load. The blast tube extensions had reduced muzzle pressure on the skin to within normal operational parameters. After 3 full combat weight firing passes 0 structural anomalies. 0. The aircraft had performed inside its design envelope throughout. Every single concern Ramsey's engineers had raised was addressed, measured, and answered by the numbers on that page. Ramsey folded the sheet, once handed it back to Hall, and turned to look at Gunn. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Get me the production specifications by Friday." Within 3 weeks, formal authorization was issued for factory integration. The 81st Air Depot Group at Townsville expanded to 3 full shifts. North American Aviation's production line in California was alerted, and Paul Gunn was on a transport plane to Long Beach with his hand-drawn blueprints rolled up under his arm and 20,000 North American Aviation factory workers waiting on the other end. The first factory-built B-25G strafers reached the Pacific in the late spring of 1943, and the Japanese reaction to encountering them was, by the accounts of surviving prisoners and intercepted communications, something close to panic. Before the strafer program, Japanese convoy commanders had developed a reliable set of defensive protocols against Allied air attack. High-altitude bombers were predictable. They were loud, they were visible from miles away, and they gave ships time to maneuver. A good Japanese captain could often angle his vessel to spoil a bomb run with 30 seconds of warning. The strafers gave no warning. They came in below radar return, below the line of sight of lookouts posted in the masts, below the depression angle of most deck-mounted anti-aircraft weapons. By the time a Japanese sailor on watch saw a B-25 strafer, the guns were already firing. The first indication that an attack was happening was often the sound of 50 caliber rounds hitting steel. There was no time to man battle stations. There was no time to bring weapons to bear. There was barely time to run. In April 1943, B-25 strafers destroyed 16 Japanese barges carrying troops and supplies near Finschhafen. In May, 12 cargo ships at Wevok Harbor were sunk in a single afternoon. The Japanese began routing convoys exclusively at night. It did not help for long. Gunn's crews trained on skip bombing in darkness, using radar altimeters to hold 50 feet above black water at 240 knots, releasing bombs by instruments alone. The Japanese called the modified B-25s the Black Death. They were not using the term metaphorically, but on the morning of July 14, 1943, an encoded Japanese signals transmission was intercepted by Allied codebreakers in Melbourne. It was not about convoy routes. It was not about troop movements. It was a direct communication between 2 Japanese naval intelligence officers describing in operational detail the exact modification specifications of the B-25 strafer. Gun positions, blast tube geometry, approach angles, skip bomb release parameters. Someone had talked, or something had been captured, or a crashed strafer had been examined too closely in a forward area. The Japanese were not going to keep flying into the same wall of fire without adapting. They were building countermeasures. And the weapon that had won the Bismarck Sea, that had turned the entire air anti-shipping doctrine of the Pacific War upside down, was about to face a threat that no amount of welding or gun mounting could solve alone. Because the Japanese were not adapting their ships. They were adapting their fighters. And in Part 3, the Black Death would have to earn its name all over again against an enemy that had finally figured out how to fight back. Paul Gunn had turned an impossible idea into a production line. The B-25 strafer had gone from a field modification welded together with salvaged parts in a Brisbane hangar to a factory-built weapon rolling off the North American Aviation assembly line in California. The Wright field engineers who had called it impractical were filing the blueprints they had once tried to bury. The Japanese convoy routes across the Bismarck Sea were empty. And in the summer of 1943, the 5th Air Force had more than 60 operational strafers hunting targets across New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the waters between them. That should have been enough. It was not. Because by July 1943, Japanese naval intelligence had pieced together exactly what was killing their ships, and the men in Tokyo were not going to keep losing convoys without a response. The Black Death was about to face the one thing it had not been designed to fight. The intercepted transmission that Allied codebreakers pulled out of the air on July 14, 1943, was detailed enough to be alarming. Japanese naval officers at Rabaul had assembled a technical analysis of B-25 strafer attack profiles, based on accounts from survivors of the Bismarck Sea convoy and subsequent attacks at Wewak and Finschhafen. They had the approach altitude right 50 feet. They had the attack speed right 240 knots. They understood the skip bomb geometry and the forward gun concentration. More importantly, they had identified the one structural weakness in the entire tactic. The strafer's devastating firepower was entirely forward-facing. Once it completed its attack run and pulled up to clear the target, its belly and rear were exposed for 4 to 6 seconds before it could bring guns to bear again. 4 to 6 seconds was enough for a Zero fighter sitting at altitude to dive through the pullout and take a B-25 from below. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and the most tactically creative mind in Japanese naval aviation, issued a standing order to all fighter units operating from Rabaul. Do not intercept B-25 strafers head-on. Let them complete the attack run. Hit them from above and behind during the pullout. The math was cold and practical. A Zero diving at 350 knots onto a B-25, pulling up from 50 feet, had approximately 4 seconds of gun time on a target that could not effectively return fire. 4 seconds was enough. In August 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 7 B-25 strafers in 16 days. All 7 went down during or immediately after attack runs against shipping. No head-on interceptions. No anti-aircraft fire. Zeros. Coming down from altitude through the pullout exactly as Genda had ordered. The loss rate had been less than 2% before Genda's directive. In August, it jumped to 11%. 11% per mission was not sustainable. At that rate, the 5th Air Force would lose its entire strafer force inside 3 months. Kenny called Gunn into his office on August 19th and laid the loss reports on the desk without saying anything. Gunn read them. He read them again. Then he sat back and was quiet for almost a minute. "They figured out the pull-out window," he said. "Yes," Kenny said. "We need top cover that stays with the strafers through the pullout. Not P-38s working at altitude. P-38s at 500 feet, following the attack run through the turn. That puts the escort at serious risk from ground fire on the approach." "Everything at 50 feet is at serious risk from ground fire," Gunn said. "That's the job." Kenny approved the new escort protocol within 48 hours. But there was a second problem that the loss reports did not fully capture, and it was in some ways more dangerous than the Zero interceptions. The expansion of the strafer program had moved faster than the training pipeline. Replacement crews arriving from the United States had logged their minimum required hours on standard B-25 configurations. They understood the aircraft. They did not understand what the aircraft had become. Skip bombing at 50 feet in daylight required a specific set of skills that took weeks of dedicated practice to develop. Doing it at night by radar altimeter alone required months. 3 of the 7 August losses were not attributable to Zero attacks. They were attributable to pilots who came in too low on the skip bomb run and flew into the sea, or who released too late and flew through their own blast radius. Major Bill Benn, who commanded the 63rd Bomb Squadron and had personally trained more strafer crews than anyone in the theater except Gunn himself, walked into the operations room at Port Moresby on August 21st and told Kenny directly that the program was outrunning its own expertise. "We are sending men on missions that require skills they do not have yet," Ben said, "and we are losing them not to the enemy, but to the learning curve." It was the kind of statement that could end a career if the wrong people heard it, but Ben said it anyway because it was true. Kenny extended the mandatory strafer qualification training from 3 weeks to 6. He grounded all replacement crews until they had completed 50 practice skip bomb runs to standard. He ordered Gunn to develop a written training syllabus, something that had not existed before because Gunn had always taught by demonstration, standing next to the aircraft and showing pilots with his hands what the instruments would tell them, then flying the mission profile himself until they could follow. Writing it down took Gunn 4 days. The resulting document was 31 pages handwritten and became the foundational training manual for every strafer crew in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. Then November 2nd, 1943 arrived. And everything that had been built, tested, argued over, nearly lost and rebuilt, came together over Rabaul Harbor in 15 minutes that settled the question permanently. Rabaul was the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific. The harbor on the northeastern tip of New Britain held on the morning of November 2nd, 38. Japanese vessels, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, cargo ships, and minesweepers. The anti-aircraft defenses ringing the harbor were among the densest concentrations of flak guns in the entire Pacific theater. Japanese fighter strength at Rabaul on that morning totaled approximately 70 operational Zeros. Allied planners had studied the target for months and concluded that a conventional bombing attack would be prohibitively costly. High-altitude B-17S and B-24S had attacked Rabaul repeatedly through 1942 and early 1943 with minimal results and significant losses. The harbor remained operational. The ships kept coming and going. Rabaul was considered in practical terms untouchable. Major Raymond Wilkins led the strike package in at 0800 hours, 137 aircraft total. 59 B-25 strafers in 4 squadrons. Australian Beaufighters for deck suppression on the lead approach. P-38 Lightnings working close escort at 500 feet through the attack, and the pullout exactly as Gunn had specified after the August losses. B-24 Liberators at 20,000 feet, dropping bombs to force the Japanese gunners to elevate to split their attention to look up for the 30 seconds it would take the strafers to cover the final 2 miles at wave-top height. The Zeros were airborne, 70 of them orbiting above the harbor at altitude exactly where they had been positioned to execute Genda's pull-out attack protocol. The P-38 escort pilots saw them and did not climb to engage. They held 500 feet and waited. The Beaufighters hit the harbor perimeter first. Deck suppression. Anti-aircraft positions along the waterfront absorbed 3 seconds of concentrated forward fire and went silent. Then the B-24s arrived overhead, and the sky above the harbor filled with black flak bursts as every elevated gun in Rabaul pointed upward. Then the strafers came in from the southeast at 50 feet and 240 knots, and nobody in the harbor had guns pointed in the right direction. Wilkins took his aircraft directly at the cruiser Agano. 600 yards out, the guns opened. The Agano's deck was swept clean in 4 seconds. Wilkins released 2 500-pound bombs at 100 yards. Both skipped, both hit. The forward magazine detonated. The cruiser's bow rose out of the water at a 40-degree angle and hung there for 2 full seconds before the ship broke apart. Wilkins pulled up hard. A Zero was already diving from above. The P-38 escort pilot cut across the Zero's flight path at 320 knots, and the Japanese fighter came apart in midair without completing its pass. The second wave of strafers was already on the harbor. The destroyer Hagikaze turned hard to port to present its bow the narrowest possible target. The B-25 split. 2 came from the port side, 2 from starboard, and the skip bombs hit both beams simultaneously. The Hagikaze rolled to starboard and capsized in 4 minutes. The transport, Kokuyo Maru, took 11 direct hits and burned so intensely that the smoke column was visible from Port Moresby 130 miles away. The minesweeper W-21 simply disintegrated. Nobody on the harbor perimeter saw it happen clearly enough to reconstruct the sequence afterward. 15 minutes after the first strafer crossed the harbor perimeter, 30 of the 38 Japanese vessels in Rabaul Harbor were hit. 5 were sunk outright. 12 sustained damage beyond repair. The harbor's fuel storage facility was burning. The repair docks were wrecked. 2 cruisers that survived the initial attack were so heavily damaged they were towed to Truk and never returned to operational service. Allied losses: 9 aircraft, including 3 P-38s lost in the escort engagements above the pullout zone, which represented the new tactic working exactly as designed. The Zeros had found targets, but the targets were American fighters armed and ready, not B-25s pulling up from a run with their bellies exposed. Rabaul was finished as a forward naval base. The Japanese combined fleet withdrew its surface units to Truk within 72 hours of the November 2nd strike. They did not come back. The logistical network that had sustained Japanese operations across New Guinea, the Solomons, and the Bismarck Archipelago for 2 years collapsed because its central hub could no longer function. Without Rabaul, Japanese forces in New Guinea began to starve. Without resupply, the defensive perimeter that Imperial General Headquarters had built around the Southwest Pacific began to contract. The road that MacArthur needed to reach the Philippines was opening one destroyed harbor at a time. In the 3 months following Rabaul, 5th Air Force strafers destroyed 214 Japanese aircraft on the ground and sank 41 ships. The loss rate dropped back below 3% after the new P-38 escort protocol became standard. Japanese convoy commanders stopped attempting daylight supply runs to any port within strafer range, which by late 1943 meant virtually all of New Guinea's north coast. The Black Death had not just won individual battles. It had made an entire geography strategically indefensible. Kenny recommended Gunn for the Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation moved through channels and came back approved at a lower decoration level, the Legion of Merit, with a citation that described his contributions as primarily technical in nature. Gunn accepted it without comment. He was already working on the next modification, a forward-firing rocket package for the B-25H that would extend effective attack range against hardened targets. The war was not over. His family was still in Santo Tomas. He did not have time to argue about medal classifications. But something had changed that no citation could fully capture and no modification could replicate. The concept Paul Gunn had welded together by torchlight in a Brisbane hangar in August 1942 had been tested against the hardest targets in the Pacific and had not failed once. The engineers had called it impossible. The bureaucrats had tried to ground it. The Japanese had adapted their entire fighter doctrine to counter it, and none of it had been enough. What happened to the man behind all of it in the final months of the war and in the decades that followed is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. And it is the part that matters most. From a salvaged welding torch in a Brisbane hangar to the most effective anti-shipping weapon in Pacific War history, Paul Gunn had taken 4 50 caliber machine guns stripped from dead men's fighters, mounted them in a nose that engineers said would buckle and proven in blood and fire that the entire theory of aerial warfare against shipping needed to be rewritten. The B-25 strafer had survived bureaucratic burial, technical near collapse, and a deliberate Japanese counter-doctrine designed specifically to kill it. Rabaul Harbor had fallen. The convoy routes were empty. The road to Manila was open. But the question that Part 3 left hanging in the air was never about the aircraft. It was about the man. What happens to the person who builds something that changes a war when the war finally ends? The answer in Paul Gunn's case is a story that almost nobody has told, and it carries a twist that changes the way you understand everything that came before it. The shrapnel that hit Gunn at Tacloban Airfield on November 27, 1944, severed an artery in his left leg and ended his combat flying career permanently. The surgeon who operated on him was direct. The damage was too extensive for full recovery. The leg would never bear the sustained physical stress of combat operations again, and at 45 years old, with 26 years of combined service, Gunn had more than earned a medical retirement and a flight home to whatever version of normal life he could reconstruct. Gunn told the surgeon he was not leaving until his family was free. He said it without drama, the way a man states a fact about the weather, and the surgeon understood that the conversation was over. He was on a cane when the 1st Cavalry Division broke through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp on February 3, 1945. He was not supposed to be there. His medical leave was still active. His orders restricted him to light administrative duty, and the drive from the hospital at Leyte to Manila was 3 hours over roads that the retreating Japanese army had mined and shelled. He made the drive anyway, with a driver who did not ask questions and a leg that hurt badly enough that he gripped the door handle for most of the journey. Pauline Gunn weighed 89 pounds. She had been eating 1 bowl of rice and vegetable soup per day for the final year of captivity. His daughter Julie weighed 63 pounds. His son Nathaniel had malaria. His youngest daughter had dysentery. They were alive. 3 years and 25 days after the Japanese occupation of Manila had swept them into captivity, they were alive and standing in a makeshift Army field hospital inside the camp perimeter, and Paul Gunn walked through the door on a cane completely gray 40 pounds lighter than the last photograph his wife had seen of him, and Pauline did not recognize him. She thought he was a doctor. Then he said her name. And she knew. The official Army report noted the reunion lasted 4 hours. Then Colonel Paul Irvin Gunn returned to his duty station. The war was not over. Other men were flying his modifications. They needed support. He went back to work. The Army retired him on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel on medical disability. He was 48 years old. He went back to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines from 3 war-surplus C-47 transport aircraft. The same stubborn mechanical energy that had turned a bomber into a gunship now turned into route planning and engine maintenance schedules, and the logistical complexity of running an inter-island airline across an archipelago, still rebuilding from 3 years of occupation and a brutal liberation campaign. By 1956, Philippine Airlines was flying to San Francisco. The man who had started with 5 Beechcraft planes before the war had built an international carrier out of the wreckage of everything the war had left behind. He never stopped flying. His pilot said he was always moving, always planning the next route, always in the air when he could be. Some of them thought he was still running from something, maybe. Or maybe a man who had spent 3 years flying toward Manila simply did not know how to stop pointing in the direction of the people he loved. He died on October 11, 1957, when a Beechcraft Model 18 he was piloting flew into a storm cell over the Cordillera Mountains north of Manila and came apart against a ridge. He was 57 years old. He would have been 58 in 1 week. The Philippine government gave him a state funeral. 6,000 people attended. The Distinguished Service Cross that General Kenny had recommended was never approved. Some review board had decided his contributions were technical rather than tactical, as though the distinction meant anything to the men who had flown his aircraft and come home alive. Kenny wrote in his memoir that Gunn was the most valuable man in the 5th Air Force. MacArthur wrote a classified letter to the War Department recommending promotion to Brigadier General. It was denied. The Army was reducing force structure. Promotions were frozen. Paul Gunn remained a colonel with a Legion of Merit and 9 Purple Hearts and a portrait in the lobby of the airline he built, and most of the employees walking past it every day had no idea who he was. But the legacy he left was not measured in rank or medals. It was measured in aircraft, and the aircraft kept flying long after Paul Gunn stopped. The 5,000 B-25 strafers built with his modifications sank more than 800 Japanese ships in the Pacific. They destroyed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They killed an estimated 85,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors. Those are the official statistics, and they are staggering on their own terms. But the deeper measure of what Gunn built is what happened to the concept after the war ended. Because the idea did not stop at 1945, it accelerated. The principle that Gunn had proven over the Bismarck Sea that a fast, low-flying aircraft with concentrated forward firepower was more effective against ground and naval targets than a high-altitude bomber became the foundational doctrine of close air support for every air force in the world that studied the Pacific War. The AC-130 gunship used in Vietnam, a modified transport aircraft with side-firing cannons that could loiter over a target and deliver sustained precision fire, was a direct institutional descendant of Gun's B-25 modifications. The engineers who designed it had read the after-action reports from the 5th Air Force. They knew the lineage. The A-10 Warthog, the most purpose-built ground attack aircraft in American military history, with its 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon firing. Depleted uranium rounds at 4,200 rounds per minute is the logical endpoint of a design philosophy that Paul Gunn sketched in pencil on a notepad in a Brisbane hangar in 1942. Forward-firing concentrated gunpowder, low altitude, high survivability through speed and suppression rather than altitude and evasion. The A-10 is still flying combat missions today. The principle is 80 years old, and it has never been improved upon in its core logic, only refined in its execution. 17 nations adopted modified versions of the strafer concept in the decade following World War II. The Korean War saw B-26 Invaders direct successors to the A-20 Havoc that Gunn had first modified flying low-level attack missions against North Korean supply columns, using forward gun packages that traced their design directly back to Gunn's field modifications. The Vietnam-era AC-47 Spooky gunship, which flew more than 300,000 combat sorties and became one of the most effective close air support platforms of that conflict, existed because American military planners had internalized a lesson that one man had proven over a Japanese convoy in 1943. The lesson was not really about guns. It was about the relationship between institutional expertise and genuine innovation, and it is the most important thing this entire story has to say. Every engineer who told Paul Gunn that his modifications were impossible was technically correct within the parameters of their training. The balance would be wrong. The blast would buckle the fuselage. The weight distribution was outside acceptable limits. These were not stupid objections raised by ignorant men. They were accurate observations made by highly trained professionals applying established engineering principles to a proposed design. The problem was not that they were wrong about the engineering. The problem was that they were evaluating a wartime solution using peacetime standards, and the two sets of criteria were not compatible. In peacetime, an aircraft modification that falls outside acceptable stress parameters gets sent back for redesign. In wartime, an aircraft modification that falls outside acceptable stress parameters but kills ships faster than anything else available gets welded together overnight and flown into combat the next morning, because the cost of waiting for a perfect solution is paid in the lives of men who do not have time to wait. Gunn understood something that the right field engineers did not because he was smarter than them, but because he was closer to the problem. He was at Eagle Farm, watching men load bodies into transport aircraft, while the engineers were in Ohio, writing memos about center of gravity. Proximity to consequence changes your tolerance for risk. When the cost of inaction is visible and immediate and personal, the calculus of acceptable danger shifts in ways that institutional process is not designed to accommodate. This is not a story unique to World War II. Chester Nimitz authorized the unrestricted submarine warfare doctrine that strangled Japanese supply lines over the formal objections of his own logistics staff. Curtis LeMay switched from precision daylight bombing to low-altitude incendiary raids against Japanese cities against the established doctrine of the Army Air Forces, because the precision raids were not working and the war needed to end. In each case, someone with proximity to consequence overrode someone with institutional authority, and the war moved faster because of it. The pattern repeats in every conflict and in every industry, where the gap between the people making decisions and the people bearing consequences grows wide enough to matter. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The one that reframes the entire story. When North American Aviation's engineers in Long Beach first examined Paul Gunn's hand-drawn blueprints in March 1943, They spent 2 weeks reverse engineering his field modifications into production drawings. They strengthened the nose structure. They redesigned the gun mounts. They added reinforced aluminum patches to the fuselage skin. They calculated the center of gravity shift and adjusted the tail trim. All of this is documented in the production records. What is not widely known is what those engineers found when they ran formal stress analysis on Gunn's original field modification, the one he had built in Brisbane with salvaged guns and a welding torch, and no calculations whatsoever. His improvised steel mounting frame, assembled by hand without a single formal measurement, was stress-rated within 4% of the optimal solution their engineering process would have produced. Not close enough to be acceptable by production standards, but close enough to prove that the man who built it was not guessing. He was calculating in his head in real time, drawing on 40 years of accumulated mechanical knowledge and arriving at answers that formal engineering methodology would take weeks to confirm. The Wright Field engineers who had dismissed his work as the improvisation of an untrained mechanic were looking at the output of a different kind of expertise, one that did not produce documentation, but produced results, and the results were nearly identical to what their instruments would have derived. Gunn never knew they had run that analysis. The report was filed internally at North American Aviation and did not surface in published records until a researcher working on Pacific Theater aviation history found it in the company archives in the early 1990s. By then, Gunn had been dead for 35 years. From a former Navy mechanic with a welding torch and 4 salvaged machine guns to 5,000 factory-built aircraft, 800 ships on the ocean floor, and a doctrine that still shapes how every air force in the world thinks about ground attack aviation. Paul Gunn did not save the Pacific War alone, but without him, the Bismarck Sea Convoy reaches New Guinea. The Japanese defensive line holds, the road to the Philippines stays closed, and the war runs longer and costs more in ways that are difficult to calculate and impossible to accept. He proved that the most dangerous thing in any conflict, military or otherwise, is not the enemy with the most resources. It is the person who is close enough to the problem to see the solution that everyone with authority has already decided cannot exist. The engineers said it was impossible. Gunn flew it anyway. And somewhere in the archives of North American Aviation, there is a stress analysis report that proves he was right all along. That is the kind of man who changes history, not the one with the most credentials, the one who cannot afford to be wrong and builds accordingly.